Almost 1 week after the unprecedented Hamas terror attacks in Israel, Israeli troops have been carrying out raids inside Gaza. The military says infantry and tank units entered to track down rocket crews, destroy weapons, and search for hostages. The raids do not appear to be the beginning of an expected ground offensive. Israel has massed troops and tanks along the Gaza border. DW correspondent Rebecca Ritters is in Tel Aviv. She told us more about the Israeli raids on Gaza.
Well, that is what we've been hearing, the Israeli military saying that they have been carrying out these very small, very targeted, very elite teams have been going in and carrying out these raids, as you said in the lead-in there, to try, particularly, I think, to look for some of the more than 100 hostages we know are being held in Gaza. This is the first shift, really, towards a ground invasion, though, as you also mentioned, not an indicative of the beginning of such a ground invasion, though that is something that is largely expected to happen in the coming days, if not week. We've been seeing, I was down there this week myself, been seeing very heavy armament and a huge troop movement around that Gaza border. And it is thought by everyone, though we've had no confirmation from the Israeli military, but it is thought that a ground invasion would be the next step. So it isn't surprising that this interim step is a way that they can enter, try and look for these hostages and do other targeted acts in there without triggering the full ground invasion at this stage.
DW's Rebecca Ritters in Tel Aviv there. Now, thousands of people are attempting to flee their homes in Gaza's north. The Israeli military has given over 1 million people just 24 hours to evacuate south. The United Nations has called the order impossible, and the terror group Hamas is telling people to stay in their homes. But many Gazans have decided to risk the journey before a possible invasion. Michael O'Hanlon is Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Thank you for joining us, Michael. I want to start by asking you about Israel's military calling these localized raids. Do you see them as a first step in a ground invasion? And what does localized raids mean at this point?
Greetings. Well, I thought your coverage was very correct to say that they're looking for certain things, and including hostages, obviously. Once they go in en masse with a big force, they know the hostages' lives are at even greater peril. And so if there's any hope whatsoever of finding those hostages, it makes sense to try to do it beforehand. However, this is very hard work to find people like needles in a haystack, to find individuals, whether Israeli or Hamas leaders or Hamas holding the Israelis, because you just don't have a lot of ways to find these individuals. You can try, you can hope you might know their cell phone numbers or be able to recognize their voices or otherwise have some kind of a telltale signature, but it's not that hard to just find a basement or an apartment and put people there. And there's no particular way modern technology can find a hostage or a Hamas leader just based on, their identity or their DNA. So it's going to take some luck to be able to find anything useful with these limited incursions. Israel has been watching the Gaza Strip for years, obviously, and so they may have some places where they suspect activity's been ongoing, where Hamas tends to do its most important work or have a lot of its key assets, but Hamas is relatively unlikely to put hostages in those places. So I think Israel's probably not going to make a lot of headway in these initial efforts, but it makes sense to try because it may be the best hope for getting anyone out of there alive.
It's interesting to me that you used that analogy of needles in a haystack, because we're also talking about an area that is very densely populated, and it's an urban terrain that is amongst the most densely populated in the world. Is it, given these circumstances, even possible for Israel's military to avoid massive civilian casualties if this so-called ground offensive is carried out soon?
It's going to be awfully hard. And this is, of course, why Israel has asked or demanded that more than 1 million Palestinians in the northern part of the Gaza Strip relocate. It's a preposterous claim at one level. How could they possibly all relocate? How could you ever expect that Hamas would let them? And yet, if they don't, they're going to be in the crosshairs of an operation that does not know exactly where it's headed. I don't think the Israelis, they have some initial targets, I'm sure, within Gaza. Beyond that, I believe they're hoping that one target leads to another. They gain intelligence as they proceed, but it's going to have to be, it's going to have to be human intelligence work, which is always painstaking, slow, and imperfect, and requires good sources to be done well. I don't know how many Palestinians are going to want to talk to the Israeli army that's about to enter into Gaza. So my overall concern is that the Israelis are not going to be able to do very well at finding what they really want, except through brute force, building by building searches, which means that there will be a lot of firefights. There'll be people with itchy trigger fingers. There'll be ambushes set up by Hamas that Israel will respond to. Innocent people will get caught up in the crossfire. Israel sometimes will think that it's being ambushed. Israeli soldiers will feel that way, even if they're not. It's going to be an extraordinarily intense and unfortunately quite lethal battleground, I'm afraid, in the coming weeks.
That sounds like a really difficult situation for everybody involved to navigate. And I may be speaking a bit too soon, but if these are the circumstances the military will be dealing with, at what point can they call for a conclusion to this kind of an offensive? What is the main goal at the end here that will make them end such an offensive?
The main goal, I believe, is the overthrow of Hamas. Now, we all know Prime Minister Netanyahu has famously said that if you're a member of Hamas, you will die. And that's sort of an understandable human emotional reaction to what's just happened to his fellow Israelis. But I'm not sure it's a realistic military objective, and I'm not sure it needs to be. But I think what Israel is going to try to do is make sure that Hamas is no longer in charge of the Gaza Strip. That itself is going to be a difficult objective to achieve. But I think that's the more realistic goal. And what they will be trying to do, therefore, is locate the maximum number of top Hamas leadership, top Hamas command and control sites, any kind of financial assets Hamas has, the weaponry that Hamas has, and also, just to be honest, to be blunt, create enough pain for everyone, not through intentional taking of civilian life, but through an operation that will lead to a lot of loss of life on all sides, that at some point Hamas can be persuaded either to step down or to otherwise allow an international supervision of the rule of Gaza going forward. I think that's where those are the parameters of the conversations that you and I and others will be having over the next 2 or 3 weeks, because you're right, it's too soon to know.
Right.
We're going to have to see what happens on the battleground before we can really know. But these are the kinds of negotiations and compromises and parameters for, adjustment that one could expect to see emerge.
Thank you for that analysis. Michael O'Hanlon from the Brookings Institution.
Thank you.
Let's take a quick look at some other news concerning the conflict. Turkey has begun sending humanitarian aid intended for Gaza. 2 Turkish Air Force planes have brought food and medical supplies into Egypt. The Rafah border crossing in southern Gaza is the only point where aid can be delivered. An artillery strike has killed a journalist and injured 6 others in southern Lebanon. Issam Abdullah of the Reuters news agency was covering clashes on the border with Israel. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned the attack highlights the risk of the conflict spilling over. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier called for solidarity with Jews during a visit to a synagogue in Berlin. He said the state must protect Jewish life after the Hamas terrorist group urged violence against Jewish communities. Steinmeier said he represents the whole nation at the side of all Jews in Germany. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has wrapped up talks in Qatar. He's been traveling around the region in an attempt to prevent the conflict widening. He began in Israel to show support and discuss hostage negotiations. Blinken also met the Palestinian president in Jordan. He says it's vital to contain the violence.
The United States and Qatar share the goal of preventing this conflict from spreading. We discussed in detail our efforts to prevent any actor, state or non-state, from creating a new front in this conflict. We're also working intensively together to secure the release of hostages, including American citizens, being held by Hamas in Gaza. I'm grateful for the urgency that Qatar is bringing to this effort.
Let's get more on that with DW's special correspondent Aya Ibrahim in Washington. It's good to see you, Aya. Did Blinken give any more details on how Qatar is helping contain this conflict?
It is expected that with Qatar's sort of special connections with Hamas, a group that is designated as a terror organization by the U.S. and others, but obviously not in Qatar, that Qatar can help with hostage negotiations in the first as a first priority, as Secretary Blinken and President Biden have reiterated again and again in the days. In the past couple of days, that the release of hostages really is a priority. He's also hoping, I mean, this is part of, he's on kind of on a whirlwind tour of the region at the moment. He's hoping that Qatar can also help with the de-escalation effects. Qatar has not only relationships with Hamas, but also relationships with the Iranian regime. And so this is definitely also about de-escalation, as well as maybe helping with hostage negotiations.
When we speak about de-escalation, we know that in that press conference we just saw Blinken in, he also fielded questions on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. How did he respond to those?
Well, he did reiterate Israel's right to defend itself in the face of these unprecedented attacks. He said that it is a priority, or that he has brought it up with Israeli partners, that Israel has to also consider civilian life in conducting these attacks, in conducting this military operation. He said that there's also an emphasis on finding humanitarian corridors for civilians within the Gaza Strip. But he was asked specifically about the evacuation order that was given to civilians in Gaza, but he did not give any details about whether or not he approves or condones that particular evacuation order.
So some careful wording from the Secretary of State of the U.S. there, but we are seeing him on, as you mentioned, this whirlwind tour. What exactly is he trying to achieve here through that?
Right, we're seeing him, he was in Bahrain today, in Qatar. He's expected to also be in Saudi Arabia, and he has been to Jordan and has met with the Palestinian Authority there. And that is really in an effort to get also players in the region to condemn the terror attacks that took place in Israel, but also in an effort to de-escalate the situation.
Yeah, Ibrahim in Washington, D.C., following that story for us of Antony Blinken's trip through the Middle East. Thank you so much, Aya.